Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Samih Milham. I am the Radiological Protection Program Lead at World Nuclear Association in London and the Staff Director of Radiological Protection Working Group at World Nuclear Association London. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar in which we are going to discuss the ICRP International Commission Radiological Protection Review process of its general recommendations. What are the stakes for the industries using ionizing radiation? I will be coordinating this webinar. Before we start, I would like to note that we have the opportunity to ask questions at any time during the webinar. Please write your questions using the questions and answer box at the bottom of your Zoom window screen. We will try to answer your questions in writing during the webinar, and other questions I will invite our speakers to answer them during the discussion part at the end of the webinar after the presentations. I would like next slide. I would like to introduce our program outline for this webinar, and also I would like to invite our speakers today to turn on their camera. First, our head of industrial cooperation, Mr. Serge Grolin. He has been working at World Nuclear Association for more than 20 years as the head of industrial cooperation. He will provide the opening remarks. Then we will move to the next topic. Dr. Marcel Lebs, he's going to talk about introduction to the Radiological Protection Working Group, and also will provide an overview of the ICRP review process. Dr. Marcel, he was the Director of Chemistry and Radiation Protection for more than 20 years, and is currently the Deputy Plant Manager for the KKG nuclear power plant in Switzerland. Marcel was member of the ICRP Task Group 93 on radiological protection of people and the environment in the event of a large nuclear accident, which resulted in the ICRP publications 146. And he has been the chair of Radiological Protection Working Group at our association since more than a decade. Then we will talk about specific issues and area of concern with regard to the ICRP review process. First, we will talk about new nuclear builds perspective, and this topic will be introduced by Dr. Peter Bryan. He is the head of environment, decommissioning and radiation safety at EDF UK Energy for a nuclear build project, Sizewell C. Pete also is a member of ICRP Task Group 120 on radiological protection for radiation emergencies and malicious events, and he is also a vice chair of the RPWG Group on Public Understanding, and he was also the former president of the Society of Radiological Protection in the UK. Then the other issues that we will discuss is the potential impacts on uranium production. It will be represented by Mr. Jim Honduras. Jim, he has been involved in radiation mining and mineral processing for almost 40 years. And he currently consults for mining companies on radiation protection, and he provides assistance to the IAA on NORM. Jim also is the president of Australian Radiation Protection Society and co-chair of RPWG Working Group on NORM and in industry. Then we're going to move to the final, but not the final topic. It's about capacity development and the need for education and training in the radiation protection field. It will be presented by Mr. Joseph. He is the health physics director at McMaster University in Canada, providing radiation safety and licensing support for the safe operation of their 10 megawatt research reactor. Class 2 facility and for more than 1,200 individuals that perform radiological work activities under the 27 Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission licenses used on and off campus. And he also the co-chair of our Radiological Protection Working Group and member of various technical standard committees in Canada, including the Canadian Standard Association Technical Committee for Management of Radioactive Waste. Now, I would like to ask Serge to provide opening remarks for this webinar. Serge, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sameh. Dear colleagues, I would like to welcome all of you to this World Nuclear Association webinar regarding the ICRP review of its general recommendations. I would like to begin by thanking members of the Association's Radiological Protection Working Group, and in particular the chair, Dr. Marcel Lips, for organizing this important webinar. And I'd also like to thank everyone who has registered today, and thank you for your presence. And I would encourage you to participate actively and to consider how you could contribute to this process. We believe that this webinar will be a very valuable opportunity to discuss the International Commission on Radiological Protection's ongoing review of the radiological protection system. It will also provide an assessment of what this review may mean for the global nuclear industry, as well as for other industries that utilize ionizing radiation. In the case of nuclear power, I think we are at a very exciting time for the industry. The energy setting suggests that that nuclear power could see major expansion in the coming years. And of course, the radiological protection system will be at the foundation of that and could constrain or even facilitate the growth that we think is necessary. Perhaps I should also add that the World Nuclear Association is a special liaison organization to the ICRP, and within the members of the RP working group, we are very active within the ICRP task groups and within Committee 4, and so we have a very good view of the process and what is at stake. So I would thank you again for taking part, and encourage you again to ask questions and to consider how you could perhaps get involved through the ICRP work, through the Radiological Protection Working Group, or in other ways in ensuring that industry has a voice as the RP regulations are discussed and shaped for future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Serge. I would like to move to the next topic, and I will invite Mr. Dr. Marcel Lips to talk about the introduction to the Radiological Protection Working Group and the ICRP review process. Marcel, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sameh. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening also from my part. As chair of the Radiological Protection Working Group, it is my honor to give this brief overview on our group and its activities, and thereafter to introduce the ICRP review process, which is currently one of the main driver of our activities. Next slide, please. The Radiological Protection Working Group is one of the cross-cutting World Nuclear Association Working Group. Its history began in 2002, when several members of the World Nuclear Association began to voice concern that the international body establishing the framework on radiological protection, the ICRP, was undertaking an analysis of its recommendations that could have led to excessive standards pertaining to radiological effects on the environment. Conceivably, such standards could have an enormous adverse impact for various parts of the nuclear industry. This raised the question of whether the nuclear industry plays an adequate consultative role in ICRP deliberations, which was deemed to be insufficient. It was with this in mind that the Radiological Protection Working Group was established. In 2007, the new ICRP recommendations were published. Thanks to some of our input, the recommendations could be influenced in some parts to ensure that the implementation remained reasonably practical. In the meantime, the field of activities of our group has become broader. We are the nuclear industry's leading body of experts in the application of radiological protection, also to maintain and improve radiation safety. We enable the World Nuclear Association to pool and share industry knowledge, ideas, concerns. We estimate the impact that any potential or new standards might or will have on nuclear industry, not limited to ICRP. This context, we engage with international organizations like ICRP, like the IAEA or the NEA, etc. This to ensure due consideration is given to proportionality and implementability with any changes in the system for radiological protection. I have to mention that the revision process of the ICRP general recommendations was relaunched some years ago. Since this in turn takes years, and some of our members are close to retirement, the generational change must now also be planned and implemented. To this end, we are also specifically committed to the appropriate education. Next slide, please. The group consists today of about 70 members, roughly a quarter of it being really active. Members come from all 5 continents and cover the faculties from the entire nuclear fuel cycle and includes also industrial research. We currently receive the most active support from Canada, from the United States, a few European countries, Japan and Australia. See the red stars on this map here. Further support from other major nuclear energy nations would give our voice even more weight. At this point, I would like to encourage the member companies to send motivated experts to our group where exciting, long-term and internationally oriented challenges await. Membership in the working group also opens the door to build up a global network. Next slide, please. And saying that, I'm just happy to welcome any new team players today. The efforts involved in the working group is of course not zero. 1 to 2 physical meetings per year, often alongside international conferences, a few virtual meetings, as well as document study and the elaboration of industry positions must be included. In return, this provides early indications of the direction in which developments in radiation protections are going, and this can be used profitably in the own company. Next slide, please. So I will now move to the second part of my presentation, in which I'm talking about the ICRP's General Recommendations Review process, which, as said, currently is the main driver of our activities. First of all, I would like to put this in a broader context, giving you a better understanding of the time frame of such a process and its impacts. I call it the RP circle. This is most probably well known by the RP experts among the audience. For those who are less involved in RP issues, it might be only partially known which bodies are really involved in the development of new regulations. The process begins with science. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, UNSCEAR, undertakes scientific evaluations of sources of ionizing radiation and of the associated exposures, effects and risks to human health and to the environment. As such, the committee provides an independent, objective, and up-to-date scientific basis for radiation safety. Governments and organizations throughout the world rely on the committee's estimates as the scientific basis for evaluating radiation risk and for establishing protective measures. The committee does not address the benefits or economics of radiation technology, nor does it set protection policies, standards, or recommendations, these being within the mandate of other international bodies like the International Commission of Radiological Protection, ICRP. And with this, I move to the second step. ICRP is an independent international organization that advances the science of radiological protection, in particular by providing recommendations and guidance on protection against ionizing radiation. In preparing its recommendations, ICRP considers the fundamental principles and quantitative basis upon which appropriate radiation protection measures can be established, while leaving to the various national protection bodies the responsibility of formulating the specific advice, codes of practice, or regulations that are best suited to the needs of their individual countries. Today, legislation in most countries adheres closely to the ICRP recommendations. The next step is then within the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is an independent intergovernmental science and technology-based organization in the United Nations family that serves as the global focal point for nuclear cooperation. IAEA assists its member states in the context of social and economic goals in planning for and using of nuclear science and technology for various peaceful purposes, including the generation of electricity. And it facilitates the transfer of such technology and knowledge in a sustainable manner to developing member states. The IAEA develops nuclear safety standards in the field of radiation protection. They are heavily based on ICRP recommendations. These IAEA standards form the basis for national legislation in the next step. Although member states based on the same standards, the national regulations often have different characteristics depending on the country. This causes problems here and there in cross-border cooperation, especially when limiting values are defined differently. At the end, in step 5 of the circle, it's the practitioner, the industry, who must ensure that the laws, regulations, and directives are implemented and applied in a compliant manner. The circle closes when data on the effects of ionizing radiation from applications in industry, but also from other data sources, provide new scientific insights. Next slide, please. All these steps don't happen overnight. It's a process that takes years. Collecting, evaluating, validating, and publishing scientific data alone is a long process. Deriving the appropriate radiation protection measures from this is a further lengthy process. This is not least because the ICRP does not do this in the quiet little room. ICRP involves the stakeholders concerned, what we, as one of the stakeholders, very much appreciate. Similarly, the development of IAEA standards is carried out in close cooperation with the member states, which also takes a lot of time. And finally, the parliamentary processes in the individual countries also takes a long time. Next slide, please. What I mean to say is that if the ICRP revises its recommendations today, the impact on practitioners will only become visible in 15 to 20 years. Therefore, it is important that the Radiological Protection Working Group thinks strategically long-term and, as a stakeholder of the ICRP, makes its contribution to development of the radiation protection system, just to increase the chance that at the end it is easy to use and implement. Any input that we do not provide today has the potential to become unnecessarily costly and impractical for the industry. Not today, not tomorrow, but in distant future. In this context, I would also like to point out that it is of little use to defend oneself against new costly and impracticable radiation protection regulations within the framework of national consultations, because the precursors to them, the recommendations and the standards, have already been adopted and are in force. And that is ultimately the reason why the ICRP is so important to us and why we want and need to provide our input on the current revision of the recommendations. Next slide. According to ICRP, the existing system has performed well and remains robust, and there are significant practical benefits to stability in the system. Nonetheless, ICRP wants to progress to remain fit for purpose as society evolves, scientific understanding advances, and new uses of ionizing radiations emerge. The review and revision of the system of radiological protection will lay the groundwork for a new general recommendations to supersede the 2007 ones. Next slide, please. This will happen in 3 steps. First, to identify some building blocks for review. And this already happened around 2018 to 2022. Then to develop these building blocks through ICRP task groups, and I come to that later on. And at the end then to prepare the next general recommendations using the building blocks. As for the first step, ICRP collected initial views from its liaison organizations, one of which is the WNA, but just one of it. There are many other liaison organizations with quite different views from the views of the industry. Next slide. And throughout the different events like webinars, conferences, etc., ICRP has now identified the many areas for potential review. I don't want to discuss them each in detail. Next slide. But there are for sure topics identified that make sense to think about. The nuclear industry, for example, has for many years had an impressive record of controlling and reducing occupational exposure, as measured by average individual exposure and collective dose. Current worker exposure levels are comparable to natural background radiation. Average worker doses are well below 1 millisievert a year, which is within the variability of natural background radiation. Exposures to the general public are in the order of a few microsieverts per year at maximum for the most exposed persons. They are about 3 orders of magnitude below mean natural background radiation and are less than the radiation dose of 1 return long-haul round-trip flight. Nevertheless, these tiny doses are sometimes questioned at most. And that's why there is more and more a need for an optimization of the total risk. With doses becoming lower and lower, radiation hazards have become less dominant, and optimization needs to be seen increasingly in a broader view. As radiation is only one among the many risks we are exposed to, it should no longer be considered in isolation of other types of hazards. The risks and benefits from any radiation source must be judged alongside of all of other types of risks and benefits, which are relevant to the decisions. For workforces, for example, other hazards might be mechanical, biological, chemical, or simply a question of conventional industrial safety. Different hazards for the general public include atmospheric pollution, climate change, flooding, drought, etc. And climate change is an example that is already creating upheaval in our society and is on course to cause a tremendous impact on our planet and human society, far more than any small change in radiation exposure ever will. So emphasizing a holistic all hazards approach will help to optimize risks and benefits from our activities. The general observation is that RP recommendations and standards to address optimization but do mostly not address explicitly such a broader view, and consequently regulation is focused solely on the radiation risks and not generally consider the broader health, safety, and environment hazards. Furthermore, for the public, and to some extent even for RP practitioners, the system of protection has become complex and not easily understood. For example, the use of dose limits, dose constraints, and reference levels, and their varying applicability to normal, emergency, and existing exposure situations are confusing, even for RP practitioners, and even more for those who are not regularly confronted with RP issues. Complexity also decreases practicability. Some degree of simplification could be envisaged to help promote a better understanding of the system, which in turn would contribute to better decision making. Next slide, please. On the other hand, there are topics which must be thoroughly questioned in terms of practicability. In the field, practitioners need a few simple variables to be able to give adequate protection in due time. A system, for example, more heavily based on gender, age, or even individual sensitivity might be interesting from a scientific perspective, but is not manageable in practice. For similar reasons, the implementation of changes in those quantities need to be considered carefully. Under laboratory conditions, the new quantities may provide better accuracy in those measurements, but in the field, the benefits may be much less as the additional expenses. In fact, any change to the system of protection must result in a clear benefit to health and safety and be practicable and proportionate in implementation. Just with these few examples, I want to show once again how important it is that we as practitioners can get involved in a targeted manner so that we are not suddenly faced with unnecessary expensive challenges in distant future. Next slide, please. The backbreaking work within ICRP takes place in so-called task groups. Currently, 31 of them are active. I will not go into detail about this. I simply want to mention that if we as practitioners want to make a difference and/or influence something, then these are the essential vessels. Unfortunately, the industry is not adequately represented in both the ICRP itself and these task groups. The reason for this are probably manifold, but I cannot deny that we as a nuclear industry are not doing enough to take seats in ICRP and the task groups. I would like to see greater commitment from the industry because it is about to shape our future with reasonable and practical decisions. Ignoring is a long-term industry risk. Next slide, please. It's not too late. In connection with the revision of the recommendations, 18 thematic blocks have currently been identified that ICRP would like to shed more light on. And among them, there are some for which the practicability must be scrutinized. Let's go try and get involved. For this, I need my group, I need you, I need all of you. And I really encourage you again to get part of that process. It is also the chance to take up and discuss already known issues. I'm thinking of over-conservatism, complexity, and related communication issues, and low-dose decision-making and all-hazards approach. Next slide. So if you are not an RP expert, it might have been difficult to follow all in detail. And for that, the main issues and needs are put together in these few bullets. The RP system has indeed become quite complex and difficult to interpret. With poor communication of radiation risks to the public and the wider stakeholders, it is difficult to make informed decisions on what is safe, especially if optimization is RP-centric and other hazards are not included in decision-making. those involved in the RP circle tend to act conservatively. These leads at the end to unnecessary over-conservatism of the circle for practitioners, and supports a tendency to minimize instead to optimize doses. And so the need to engage with ICRP task groups activity is bigger than ever. That's where we are and where we need to go. Next slide. If we as practitioners and industry want to have a practical and simple 2040 RP legislation, we need to change that picture. With a stake less than just 1%, we are far away where we intentionally wanted to go in 2002, as the Radiological Protection Working Group was founded, namely playing an adequate consultative role in ICRP deliberations. 2/3 of the ICRP community represents universities and regulators. An industry stake, at least as big as the one from medical practitioners, which is the green sector on this slide, should be envisaged. For this, the Radiological Protection Working Group does not have enough resources and needs immediate support. Again, I'd like to encourage the member companies to send experienced and motivated experts to the Radiological Protection Working Group, or at least to apply to become a member of one of these ICRP task groups. Next slide. And with this, I close my presentation. Thank you very much. And I hand now over to my follow-up speakers, who will present 3 specific issues related to the ICRP review process. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marcel. Can we have the next slide, please? And the one after that as well, thanks. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this particular lunchtime webinar, or whatever time it is, day it is, wherever you are. So I just really want to pull up on a few points that Marcel already raised, as did Serge, and give you a bit of a perspective from the new build side in terms of why we feel this review is particularly important and what it means to us. So what you can see on your screen is really a graph showing radiation exposures as a function of time, what they're looking like at different regions of the world. Now, as already was mentioned, since the introduction of the system of radiological protection, and in particular the ALARA principle, the nuclear industry has really had an incredibly good track record in reducing occupational and environmental exposures across the entire nuclear fuel cycle. Now, what we're finding, though, is in recent industry feedback, and this isn't just related to nuclear new build, there is evidence that as the exposures continue to decline, the application of the ALARA principle in its purest sense can result in a disproportionate outcomes in terms of wider non-radiological hazards, but also the use of resources. And by that, I mean both human resources and physical resources as well. So this is basically leading to a general push for day-to-day exposures in nuclear power generation to be far lower than that in other forms of energy generation, or compared to other sectors that use radiation, such as medical or minerals refinement, or compared to exposures we get from even natural sources of radioactivity as well. Now, this is at a great cost for what's ultimately a negligible improvement in public protection. Next slide, please. Now, alongside this, what we're seeing is ongoing concerns of climate change. And the UK, as with other countries, including, I'm sure, including a number of you on the call, have made a commitment to embrace low carbon energy systems. And to support that ambition, new nuclear power has been identified as a key part of that energy mix. So myself, I work for one of the new nuclear builds in the UK, which will generate 7.5% of the electricity generating capacity when it's fully operational. Now, what this new nuclear ambition really highlights is the need to further develop a system of protection. And that's ultimately to ensure fair treatment of the perceived unique radiological risk of nuclear power. And also to minimize any unnecessary delays or costs associated with that. And ultimately to help us tackle climate change more effectively and faster. Now, to achieve this, there are a couple of key points, just 3 that I want to raise, which really I think are important considerations in the ICRP review. The first one Marcel already touched on, which is the need to see an evolution of the ALARA principle to ensure it beds all hazards. But it needs to go more than just looking at all hazards. It actually also needs to ensure a sustainable outcome. So that means it really is balancing, as you can see on the screen, the economics with the protection of people and the environment from all hazards and the societal impact. And when you start looking at environment, society and economics, and safety can be part of society, then actually what you are trying to do is just achieve sustainability in its broadest sense and definition. Now, this is key not only in ensuring we're getting the right outcomes in our decision making, but it's also going to play a really key role in the future use of green financing. And for those of you in Europe, you'll have heard a lot of information over the last few years around the European green taxonomy and the push for sustainable technologies. So actually getting this right from the ICRP level and into domestic regulation and below that is really key in enabling that use of green financing. Alongside this, we need to see a greater need for a graded approach to radiological protection. Now, what do we really mean by that? That's really showing that your emphasis on improving radiological protection should be based on clearly defined value-benefit judgments. So basically focusing your area of effort on where there's the greatest level of risk, and ultimately not responding to external pressures to minimize exposures and really taking a proportionate and balanced treatment. And the last point I'd like to raise is the need for stability. What won't help the nuclear industry is if the review results in a complete rewrite of radiation protection standards and legislation. Stability actually helps avoid some of those unnecessary changes and those things we need to anticipate in new nuclear build. But where they are needed, and there will be areas where there will need to be changes, we should also ensure that the changes are outcome focused. So it's not just a change for a negligible improvement in radiation protection. They should be focused on it's really going to fundamentally improve protection of people, protection of the environment. And it should also be looking at moving towards simplicity. So if a change is needed, make it simple. And that's to make it simple to be understood by both practitioners, but also the public, so you avoid confusion and you really enable the system to be effective in that regard. And those are the 3 key points I really wanted to raise from my perspective. So just to reiterate, it's around evolution of the ALARA principle for all hazards and sustainability, a graded approach to radiation protection, and avoiding changes where they're unnecessary, and where they are, focusing on simplicity and the ability to communicate that to practitioners and the public. And on this point, I'll hand over to the next speaker. So over to yourself, Jim.
Let me say thank you, Pete, and hello to you all, and thank you for joining us. Many of my comments are going to really reinforce some of the comments already made by Marcel and Pete, but I'd like to make them from the perspective of the front end of the nuclear fuel cycle, which is the uranium mining and production industry. It's also important to note that these comments are also valid for industries with naturally occurring radioactive materials, such as mining and production of rare earths, mineral sands, and some base metal mining, such as copper and gold. And interestingly, many of the rare earth production and mineral sands production products end up in sustainable energy sources. One of the most important observations from my perspective is about time frame. And a number of people say it's in the future. It's 20 years away. Don't worry about it. But that's a little bit negligent on our part. The time frame of the ICRP review is very similar to the time it takes for a new mine to come in production. For us to start up a new uranium mine from a discovery through exploration, through project approvals, and project approvals take a long time, and then into development and production is about the same time frame as this review. So the outcomes of this review will affect existing mines and new operations in the future. Therefore, as already been stated, we have an opportunity now to ensure that any new system is fit for purpose into the future and that it doesn't introduce unnecessary constraints. One of the key aspects in ensuring that the system is fit for purpose, and can I ask you to go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. I sort of powered on without realizing that the slide wasn't up. But one of the key aspects in ensuring that the system is fit for purpose is to remind policymakers and others in industry that radiation is one of a number of hazards that needs to be managed. We talk about an all hazards approach. I like to call it radiation is one of a number of hazards. And almost always, it is not the most important hazard that needs to be managed. I refer here to the picture in this slide, which is an old practice. It's currently not standard practice, but it's an old practice of checking the underground tunnel roofs for loose rocks using a 2-meter steel bar and listening for dull thuds, which means that there's a loose rock. The aim of this photo is not to scare, but it's just to point out that the many hazards that do exist in mining and in industrial settings. And as we've already heard, the Radiation Protection Working Group notes that the all hazards approach is critical in the ICRP review, that radiation is considered in perspective with all the other hazards. Another important point is that there are many countries developing their uranium resources at the moment. And many of those countries do not have history in mining uranium. So they are also developing their capabilities. And therefore, we almost have a responsibility to ensure that the system is understandable and is able to be applied in practice. If it's not understandable and complex, then that's where problems will occur. We should also ensure that any change that occurs does result in an improvement in safety. Purely administrative changes or changes for the sake of change are really not justified. Most importantly, the new ICRP system should aim to ensure that there is no increase in the fear of radiation. And this can occur when more regulations come into place. If I look at that picture, what I want is that miner to be thinking about his task, not worrying about whether there's additional radon there. They need to focus on what the task is. So fear of radiation is an important thing we need to think about if there's an increase in regulatory requirements. So that's all I had to say. So from the front end or the mining perspective, there are a number of areas that the working group is looking at, and they are consistent with the broader message of the working group for the nuclear fuel cycle. So with that, Joe, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jim. And if I can ask to go to the next slide. So the nuclear sector is facing a major challenge. An aging workforce with important experience and technical capability is leaving the industry through retirement. The new generation of students and young professionals are passionate about the environment and our net zero goals. They see nuclear as part of the solution, but we need to engage them in the work that is required for us to achieve net zero by 2050. Marcel has shown that changes to the system of radiation protection is a long-term process. The decisions that we make today will significantly impact what we plan to do in the future. One of my favorite leadership quotes is that the person that knows how to do something will always have a job, but the person that knows why something has to be done will always be their boss. Building new nuclear, from SMRs to full nuclear power plants, are long-term projects. They require a mix of experience to young nuclear professionals so that they can learn, develop, and continue this work while the aging and experienced individuals retire. We don't just need a workforce to execute these projects. We need the people that understand why we are doing it in the first place and know the basis behind the various regulations, programs, governance, and industry best practices that are currently in place. We also need the system of radiation protection to be simple and clear enough that it can be communicated and understood by individuals both within and outside of the nuclear industry. What we need to do as an industry is first we need to inform and engage students to get into this field. We then need to have academic programs that provide them with the base knowledge required to work in nuclear, from science and technology to communications and regulations. We need to have industry opportunities for hiring these individuals and pairing them up with our industry experts for knowledge transfer. Then we need to support and encourage involvement of our industry experts in the World Nuclear Association working groups and providing input into the next revision of the system of radiation protection. We need to build risk-based radiation protection programs that are simple and clear so that a new individual can understand it, implement it, and communicate it to the public. The system of radiation protection is changing, and we need to ensure that we have the right people in place from industry during this transition to understand not only the how, but the why. The World Nuclear Association RP Working Group is the forum for the industry to collaborate and provide input into the ICRP general recommendations for the system of radiation protection and other international regulatory documents and guidance that will impact the way that we implement nuclear technologies in the industry. I know that we're all busy, but an investment in developing the next generation of young professionals and their involvement and input into international standards will benefit not only the industry as a whole, but each organization that makes this investment in its workforce development. We are looking to you all to provide your industry experts, both early career and experienced, to support the work of this group. And with that, I will pass it back to Sami.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Now we're gonna summarize what the particular challenges that we faced and we highlighted during this presentation regarding the ICRP review process. My colleague Serge, I will hand the floor to my colleague Serge to summarize all these challenges and to highlight this topic. Serge.
Okay, thank you, Sami. So I'd like to thank all the speakers, and I think there was a very consistent, there was a very effective tag team, as I could say, and we went from one to the other, but very consistent messages about the need for clear communications, for simplification of the system, for all hazard approach, for graded approach, practical approach, listening to the views of practitioners around the world. And another clear message is that if we do not act, I would say I don't want to say it's an urgent, but this is a strategic thing, not a sort of knee-jerk thing, but we have to think strategically, both within the nuclear industry. Most people attending today are from the nuclear power industry, but also we need to work across nuclear technology sectors, and I'm really pleased to see representation from the medical industry, for example, on the call. And incidentally, we have recently created a cooperation forum for nuclear technology associations. It embraces 21 international associations covering various aspects of nuclear technology, nuclear power, medical, non-destructive testing, irradiation services. And these different associations, they may have perhaps not fully overlapping interests with regard to this review, but I think it's really important that we have a dialogue and see. I think while we may have different interests, we all should concur that the need for simple and a system that is easy to implement. I was talking to a colleague the other day about how we would be able, what would the communication be like if we had another incident on the scale of a Fukushima. And unfortunately, at the current time, I don't think we would be in a much better situation. So this review should be also, it's not just addressing the operations, but it should also be about addressing incidents that we don't create unnecessary fear and panic in communities and societies, which can be more damaging than the radiation risk itself. So I think that's my short summary of the excellent presentations, and I believe that we have some question and answers now, and so I'll turn my mic off and open it up.
Thank you very much, Serge. Before moving to the question part, I would like to highlight a very important event that will take place in Bristol in the UK in September. Our association will be hosting this event, the ICRP workshop on holistic optimization and effective communication of radiological protection system. This ICRP workshop is like conducting and it held at regular basis, like annual basis, just before the well-known ICRP symposium. The upcoming ICRP symposium is going to be in Tokyo, in Japan, in November. So we offer to host this workshop in Bristol in UK. And as my colleagues and Marcel mentioned, that most of the ICRP task groups representatives are coming from academic institutes and research organizations. And there's like a few representatives coming from the industry to present the views and the industry perspective. And this is maybe like could like led to the poor communications topics that was addressed within the radiological protection systems, and also poor applications of optimization of protections. So we would like to address these kind of challenges in these workshops, and also to address the holistic optimization and to show best practices and practical examples of application of optimization based on all hazard approach, and also to show good practices of effective communications with the public and interested stakeholders. So I would like to invite you and encourage you to register for this workshop in September, and the deadline, I think, for registration, it's mid of September, and there's still an opportunity for selected speakers like to present their views and perspective from a nuclear industry. As I mentioned, like we would like that the topics that will be addressed in this workshop to be more like practical, more than like theoretical. So I'll encourage you to register for this workshop. So now I will move to the next part regarding to have discussion and questions and answer. And I see we have quite a few questions in the question and part in the Zoom. And yeah, there's a very important questions regarding the ICRP review process and the radiation protection circle. I would like to invite Marcel to answer this question. The question is, beyond the ICRP review, is there or there will be an initiative to evaluate and provide recommendations to the ICRP and IAA and practitioners' perspective to avoid fragmented interpretation of risk, since ICRP focus on one topic? Or are there plans for ICRP to provide recommendations beyond radiation protection? Do we have mapping for all stakeholders and possible impact within radiation protection circle? Marcel, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Same, for these questions. It's quite a complex question, and as far as I know, and I talked to many of ICRP representatives, they will not provide recommendations that go beyond RP. And I can understand this in a way, because they are experts in radiological protection. They are maybe not experts in biology. They are not experts in chemistry. They are not experts in industrial safety and whatever they have to deal with. But what we need to make sure, and that this is a point we're working for, that ICRP opens these connections to other tasks like and other hazards. So just in order to make sure that RP is not in isolation, not considered in isolation, and that these recommendations would allow this all hazards optimization, maybe not being fully optimal just through the glasses of radiological protection, but through the glasses of an overall safety review. This for this part of the question. And the other one is, well, the circle, this is all already established since years, and I don't think that will be a lot of change there. And just from the roles of all these international bodies, there won't be developments in fully parallel way. But of course, IEA is working together with ICRP, and the IAEA is part of the United Nations family and UNSCARE as well. So people know each other, they discuss with each other, but the roles of these bodies are quite different. And as for us, as a liaison organization to the ICRP, of course, we know the other colleagues coming from other organizations, and they're manifold. You know, it's International Labour Organization, it's the Nuclear Energy Agency, and they have so many different views, sometimes completely opposite to what we would like. So, and this is the challenge then, to find kind of a compromise that is covering all these facts that are on the table. And the workshop in Bristol that Sami mentioned is a good tool for that, to bring up maybe a common view of some of the challenges in future. So far, my thoughts to this question. Thank you.
Pete, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think it's really important to understand the level at which the ICRP is operating at as well. So, I mean, there's been quite a bit of discussion within ICRP around what could be included within the update around all hazards. And I think in reality, what we'd end up getting is just a line, which will be in the recommendations, which might just be a change to how ALARA is interpreted to say it should be including all hazards. What ICRP won't do is tell you exactly how we should apply that principle in terms of looking at all the hazards in balance. That's where they've been asking, actually, a lot of people to say, give us practical examples of how this can work. But ultimately, it will be up to the individual domestic regulators and international bodies that sit broader than that to help look at the application piece. I would say this has been raised also with IEA. I know OECD NEA has done a lot of work on this as well. So it is coming from multiple directions in terms of doing this. But I think it's really important to understand what we'll end up getting out of ICRP, which is just probably more of a standards level, that kind of alteration to the text.
Thank you, Pete. Yeah, I think there's like a comment like related to this topic, saying like there's a president of ICRP to consider harm or risk other than arising from radiation, and he provided example for ICRP publication 45 that developing a unified index of harm. And I think like this is really important, like to focus on these subjects, and also to focus that on these challenges to the nuclear industry, and present not only the hazards coming from radiation perspective, but also from all risk like industrial and mechanical, based on all hazard approach. We need to highlight this message. Roger, would you like to comment on this topic as well?
I'd just like to add to this debate. I don't think we should have an expectation that somebody, ICRP or anybody else, is going to come out with an overall way of combining all of the different possible hazards that are faced in workplaces. It's far too complex. It would be theoretical. It would take 50 years to develop, and it wouldn't be useful when it was developed. I think that all we can hope for is a top-tier statement from ICRP, which flows through and gives top-tier statements from the IAEA in their standards, that radiation must never be considered in isolation, right? The last thing we want is ICRP to try and move into generating a total unified picture, or the IAEA to do that. They have their competences in the world of radiation, and they are not the right body, if anybody is, to try and generate a totally unified picture. But if we get top-tier statements which are very firm and very robust in both ICRP and the IAEA, then that helps point the regulators and the operators to deal locally with any particular situation, to take a holistic approach. At the moment, as we all know, there are many regulators whose competence is only radiation. They have no competence in chemical hazards or industrial hazards or whatever. Something has to point, right, by generating a very top-tier strong statement that you can't just look at radiation hazards. Thanks.
Thanks, Roger. There's also very interesting questions regarding the effective communication of radiological protection system. I see you, Roger, you have already answered these questions. The question is, what has led to the poor communications about radiation to the public? Would you like to comment on this, Roger, as well?
Well, if I read what I just posted, yes, it's a complex situation. The early nuclear weapons program created an image, and also there's the well-known, you can't see it, feel it, smell it, which gives rise to more concerns naturally than other sorts of hazard. But the concern that we have, which is perhaps the focus for this review, is that this current focus in the system of protection and in regulation on very small doses is actually feeding fear and generating concern, summarized by, well, if it has to be that low, then it must be dangerous, right? And in particular, if you look at the natural background radiation and the public dose limit of 1 millisievert, that in itself starts to feed fear. Well, man-made radiation must be much more dangerous than natural radiation. So the system that we have at the moment and its focus on dealing with pretty low doses feeds fear that there's no safe level of radiation. So the objective of this review is to get a better perspective by integrating the system into things like, well, comparing with natural background, something that intrinsically gives this better perspective. So that's the challenge of the review, to try and diffuse this emphasis on moving to ever lower doses, which just intrinsically feeds concerns.
Thank you, Roger. Pete, would you like to comment on this as well?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that the whole piece around communication radiation risk, it's been an evolving one that gets more and more complex and more difficult, because the other side is how we communicated many years ago to how we communicate today is very different. You know, social media, misinformation spread, it's much harder to tackle misinformation around radiation risk. And part of it, as Roger says, is down to the fact there might be parts of in the system playing that role in terms of a system of radiological protection. Other parts of it is media misinformation that gets out there as well. And I think this really highlights the point that actually it's how do we communicate is really important in this, and who should communicate. I think as a radiation protection profession, we've always felt that communicating on radiation risk lies solely with us, but we're always not the best people to communicate radiation risk. And communication in its own right is a science. And this is why, if it is a topic that is going to be considered by ICRP, there's a real need for them to recognise this isn't necessarily their area of expertise, and they do need to broaden it and bring in specialists on communication. So I know, for instance, in ICRP Task Group 120, the one I sit on emergency exposures, we made a conscious decision to bring in media specialists. Because actually, people who understand how to communicate the best in an emergency might be people who do a lot of communication anyway. And what I'd say is, lastly on communication, there is a piece that one thing we haven't done very well is we always talk about how safe nuclear power is. And there's a psychology here that actually you shouldn't do that. Because when you say to someone, don't worry, it's safe, people will go, oh, why are they telling me that? Is it unsafe? And this comes back to the types of evidence we saw, for instance, in the COVID pandemic. And it's really important to remember the whole point of communication isn't to tell people it's safe. It's to allow people to make their own informed decision on what is safe, because that is very subjective and a personal decision in its own right. So I think there's a lot of work to do here. It's really great to see ICRP are going to pick up on it. There's some things they can do, make it more simple to understand, avoid that misinterpretation. But then there are wider pieces which is much broader than that and nearly needs to bring in the social and communication sciences.
Thank you, Pete. Marcel, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Sami. So I think there's two other things to mention at this point. And the first point is has already also to do with the current system. I told you during my presentation about these different applications in the different situations. So, and as Roger said, the current dose limit for the general public is 1 millisievert. In case of an accident, we get a dose constraint of 100 millisieverts. So what does that mean for the general public? You know, is 1 millisievert is safe? Why should I get 100? This is terrible, you know. Or vice versa. Why is 100 okay in an emergency situation? So is that 1 millisievert overly conservative? And this creates confusion. I think it's one point that we need to clarify also with the next generation of recommendations. And the second point I want to mention that begins much earlier, it's the question of education. When I think back to my own education, I went through school, I went to university, and I wrote the PhD. And at the end, after almost 30 years of education, I heard, oh, there is an alpha, beta, and gamma decay. I didn't know at that time what the millisievert is or what impact the millisievert does have. So nowadays, you know, in school, we are dealing with many risks. We're educating children and people about many risks, traffic risks. We have campaigns to protect ourselves against AIDS, or I don't know what kind of things. But we never talk about radiation. And it should become a part of the standard education program to talk about radiation, about what can be wrong with, what are the benefits of, and just to get this as part of our normal life. When I fly to meet you all there in a Radiological Protection Working Group meeting, I sit in an airplane and every time I get an instruction, what happens in case of an emergency? And no one in the airplanes have the feeling, oh, it's dangerous. But we always talk about. And I think this is a point we need to bring our education system to just also talk about radiation, the threats, but also the benefits. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcel. There is also questions regarding the plans to formalize a uniform criteria for future development of radiation protection professionals. Would you like Marcel to comment on this?
It's difficult to give a clear answer on that, because the system evolves, science evolves, and I think it would be not reasonable just to have RP professionals with a narrow-minded view. And this covers a little bit my idea and our idea to broaden up the holistic and graded approach. And from my understanding, the future RP professional should be a professional in radiation protection, but should also be open-minded to cover, to look to the left and to the right, to give the best protection to the people under existing situation. Is it in chemistry or is it in a combined threat? And I think that would be very important to get that broader view. Thank you.
Maybe Joseph, you would like to comment on this because it's regarding future development of future radiation protection professionals.
Yeah, I was just going to put my hand up. Thank you. I would say I agree with Marcel. I don't think it's necessarily, it's definitely not necessarily an easy answer. There is definitely, within a lot of countries, there's already, certification processes and so on for, radiation safety professionals to show that they have a, certain, education, certain experience, certain understanding of the program. I think at this point, one of the things that we recognize is that, we really do have a number of individuals that have had, decades of experience in radiation safety that are, leaving the industry. And one of the key things that we need to do, as I presented, is to try to find a way to, take this new generation and pair them up so that way they can gain that experience. And we also need to look at, making sure that our programs are documented clearly, so we're not basing our decisions on what certain technical experts remember in their experience, but we've developed programs that are clear and understood so that the new generation can come in, understand it, and implement it. But I guess in short, the answer is really no, in the sense that we're not looking for a uniform criteria. But having said that, I think we are looking for, I think the minimum criteria is already set. We're really looking for building that experience.
Thank you so much, Joseph. There's the last questions is regarding your comment, Roger, regarding the top tier statement. And the question is whether ICRP could consider, and we should focus on it, and it would be worthwhile for the IAEA practitioner, but it's completely also different topic for national regulations. And is there any initiative to get in the involvement of national regulations as well? Roger?
I think it is, when it comes to dealing with national regulations, I think that's a matter for the industry and the practitioners in each country to sit down, hopefully cooperatively with their regulators to work out the best thing for that particular country. I think that it's quite helpful to engage with some international groupings of regulators, but they tend to be regionally based. I know there is in Europe, HERCA, which is the umbrella organization of many of the European national radiation regulators. And I believe, for example, that they've been invited to the Bristol seminar that that Sameh was talking about that will be held in late September. So on a strictly national basis, I think that's locally up to each industry in that country to deal, but it can be helpful to deal with sort of wider groupings of regulators such as HERCA. I know there's FORO, which is an organization of South American regulators. I'm not sure that similar organizations exist in other parts of the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Roger. There's like last questions about the presentation, and for your information, this webinar have been recorded, and the presentation slides and the record will be available on WNA website. So everybody will have an access to download the presentation and listen to the record. And finally, I would like to encourage you all to visit our website, WNA website, and become familiar with the work and activities, events, publications, and position statements regarding the Radiological Protection Working Group toward the Nuclear Association. And please, if you have any questions regarding the work of Radiological Protection Working Group and their events, don't hesitate to contact us. Also, you could find the activities and events with regard to the other working groups as well. Finally, I would like to thank you again for participating in this webinar. Thank you so much.